Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor Podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of Radical Candor and Just Work.
And I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor. Amy's out today teaching Radical Candor, so Kim and I will be bringing you the banter. I'll try to keep up with Amy's quick turns of phrase.
You know, I substituted for Amy last time, and it was hard. It's hard to be a podcast host.
It's a job, and she does it really well.
She does.
We've mentioned in some previous episodes that at many organizations, the only opportunity for growth and advancement and a pay bump is to become a manager. So for folks who thrive on building a team and guiding others to achieve results, becoming a manager may be a dream come true. For high-performing individual contributors who are experts in their fields, however, and may have a low frustration tolerance for herding cats, management can be an absolute nightmare. So how do you know if management is right for you? Way back in season 1, Kim and Russ had a conversation about this. However, given the recent data, which we will share links to in the show notes, that bad management is costing the global economy trillions of dollars, deciding whether or not to become the boss is a decision one shouldn't take lightly. I would argue you should never take it lightly, even if it wasn't costing the economy trillions of dollars.
Yes, I agree. The trillions of dollars are really beside the point. You create misery if you're a bad boss. And that does cost trillions of dollars. But before that, it creates misery. And that's the real problem.
Yeah, we can start with taking a look at our own experiences. We obviously, both you and I, decided at some point to become managers, people managers. Was that an intentional decision on your part, Kim?
Yes, it was intentional, although I think my intentions were not always perfect.
Yeah.
So I think, so I'll say a few things, and then I'll kind of tell my story about that decision. I think, first of all, if you're reluctant to become a manager, that does not mean you shouldn't become a manager. I think, in fact, if you're overeager to become a manager, that may be a bad sign about what your intentions are. And so, at the same time, if you've really thought deeply about it and you decide you don't want to do it, it's going to make yourself and everyone else miserable to do it. So don't do it if you really don't want to. I think one of the best questions that a professor of mine, Richard Tedlow, ever asked was, do you want to be a manager or do you want to do the things that managers do? And that's kind of the way to think about this. And so then that begs the question, what do managers do? So we can talk about that in a minute, but do you want me to sort of describe my journey to becoming a manager, or what's next? Since you're the host, I'm going to rely on you to tell me what to do, Jason.
Yeah, actually, before we go on to, I think our goal in this episode is to help listeners start to answer the question whether being a manager is right for them. And hopefully by sharing our own experiences, we'll give them some thought starters at the very least, if not guidance, about whether they might be on the right path. But I'm kind of curious, what do you think you said your professor, what do you think he meant by that question? What was he trying to distinguish between, because it's cleverly worded.
Yeah. Be and do.
Yeah.
So I think what he meant is, I think bad reasons to become a manager are because you want sort of the authority that comes with being a manager. You want the power that comes with being a manager. You want the money that comes with being a manager. And none of those are good reasons to become a manager. Those are kind of I want to be the boss. That is not a good reason to become a manager. Whereas if you enjoy helping people improve, if you kind of have that coaching mindset where you're really interested in helping people get better at their job, that's one of the things that managers do through feedback. If you have a dread, a lot of people describe that they have an existential dread about feedback, and that's okay. I think that's actually very human and normal. But if you have some interest in overcoming that existential dread and being the person who's willing to both hear it and to give praise and criticism, that's one of the things that managers do.
Mm.
And another thing that managers do is they build teams. And part of building a team is deciding who you're going to hire, who you're going to promote, and who you're going to fire. And those are hard, really difficult things to do. And you've got to be willing to do those and to take that seriously. And then, of course, managers get stuff done. You also need to, as you get stuff done, spend time listening, helping people clarify their thoughts. You need to be willing to create a culture of debate. You need to be willing to help others persuade each other, and that whole get stuff done wheel that we've talked about. So
Yeah.
you don't get to jump directly to implementing ideas that you have. There's a lot of stuff you got to do before that.
Right. So I actually think that's a perfect segue into our first topic, which is, what is it really like to be a manager? You just described a bunch of things that managers do, but what is it really like to be a manager? And I wonder if you have any stories that you feel like encapsulate what it is like to be a manager.
Yeah, I mean, one of them is a story that I think I've told, but maybe bears repeating, which is I had started this company, Juice, and I walked into the door, and I had planned that day to set aside the first 2 hours of the day to make an important pricing decision. So I walked in the door and ready to, I was in this, I'm going to crunch a bunch of numbers and figure out how to price this product. And somebody walked up to me and was having a major health problem. So I had to stop and talk to him. And we spent about 30 minutes talking and having a cup of tea. And I encouraged him to go home and take care of this health issue that was coming up. And then I walked past another employee, and his child, I knew, was in the intensive care unit. And so I couldn't just say, "How's it going?" or say nothing. So I spent some time talking to him. And then, and again, encourage, like driving my employees out the door, encourage him, even if he didn't need to go back to the hospital, to go home and sleep or go take a swim or just to take care of himself for this period of time, because he was under, incredible emotional and practical stress. And so now I take a deep breath. Okay, well, I still have about an hour or so to work on this pricing decision. So I passed by another employee, and his daughter has just won like the #1 math award in the city of New York, which is a big deal. So now I'm like having to shift very quickly from sort of having compassion for one parent's real terror and celebrating with another.
Yeah.
Another. And so it's like emotional whiplash. And by the time I finally sat down to try to make the pricing decision, I felt wrung out. So I went into a private room and called my coach, and I said, "Am I an emotional babysitter or the CEO?" Stupid question. And she said to me, "This is called management, and this is your job."
Yeah.
So that moment for me was a realization that a lot of this work that felt like sort of a sideshow was actually very central to the job of being a manager. And actually I realized I care about, that's way more interesting than the pricing decision. And the pricing decision still had to be made. And so I think that for me is what it's like to be a manager. A lot of the work that you're doing, it doesn't feel like it is your job, but it is your job.
I feel like every manager that I have managed has come to me with essentially that same question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is, what is it that I am doing? I feel like I get pulled around in 10 different directions every day, and it's very hard for me to sort of do the focused work that I'm used to doing. And I think this to me is a key question for someone who's considering becoming a manager, which is, if your happy place is hours of uninterrupted time thinking very deeply about a particular problem and then sort of crafting a solution to that problem, that's very hard for a manager to pull off. Not impossible, but it is very hard for a manager to pull off. I think I remember in a really humbling way, I was managing the design team at Khan Academy, And I remember similar situation, but I was like, I'm going to go, there's this thing that I wanted to fix on the site for a million years, a little bug, visual bug on the site. And today I'm going to fix that bug and I'm going to like check in some code for the first time in a really long time. So I go and I sit down and I start to fix this bug. Similar thing, a parade of interruptions.
Yeah.
Walk into my office. And it was emotional whiplash in the same way that you're describing. Someone was dealing with a personal problem. Someone was dealing with a really difficult work situation and they needed some advice. Someone was actually looking to brainstorm with me because they had a problem that they were trying to solve and they wanted my input on it. And I remember getting to this, this is like morning into lunchtime and it's late. So it's like 12:30 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And the last sort of interruption is walking out of the office. And I said, I'm really looking forward to getting back to fixing this issue that, this bug that's been around the site for a long time. And he looked over my shoulder and he said, "Oh, you can't fix it that way. If you fix it that way, it's going to break these 3 other things." And he's like, I have an idea of how to fix it. So I'm just like, give me 5 minutes. And he went back to his desk. 5 minutes later, he had checked in a fix for the whole thing. So like this like whole plan that I had, not only was it like, did I not have the time to do it, but I was going about it the wrong way. And part of the problem was I didn't have the time to I wasn't in the work in the same way that I had been for a long period of time. And I remember the feeling of chagrin. I was sort of like embarrassed that I was like, oh, I'm so great. I'm going to figure this out. And he was like, no, you're going about it all the wrong way. And in 5 minutes he had solved it. So I had set aside a whole morning to solve something that a person on my team could solve in 5 minutes better than I could. Yeah. And that was the moment where I realized, oh, that's not the job. The job isn't to like swoop in and fix a particular thing. The job is to know who on the team is really great at fixing that kind of thing and make sure that they're aware that it's a problem. And then we can figure out how to get it fixed the right way in less time.
Yeah. I had a similar experience where when I was managing the AdSense team at Google, it was really important to me that everyone who was managing still was getting their dirt under their fingernails. That they were doing the core job, that they were answering some of these, for example, customer support questions.
Yep.
And so I like made a really big deal of demanding that all the people working for me spend a certain amount of time each week answering customer support emails. And finally, someone right out of college on the team came to me and very quietly said, "Could you please ask your managers to stop doing that? They mess up everything. They're creating way more work for us." And so figuring out, so we had to come up with a different way where they just observed people working, but they still spent the time understanding what was going on. So it's important to know how to do the work. But often when you sort of dip in and dip out, you cause more harm than good.
Right. And I think the catch is that you're used to being a value, like theoretically, you're used to generating value through individual actions. That most people's work experience is generating value through individual actions. And all of a sudden you're being asked to do a job where your job is to help other people generate value through their individual actions. And maybe even if you're doing really well as a manager, to help them collectively do more than they could do individually.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a very different thing from doing it yourself. I mean, and just because you like to spend long hours of uninterrupted time thinking doesn't mean you'll be a bad manager. I mean,
correct.
I'm a writer, and so when I am in writing mode, I am spending long hours of uninterrupted, and I love that. For most of my career, I couldn't support myself writing, and so I spent most of my time being a manager, and I did spend a little bit of time. I wrote a novel while I was managing teams at Google, but I did that. I didn't have a lot else going on in my life. And so I did that sort of early in the morning and late at night. So you can do both, but it's tricky.
And I think we're pointing to a couple of different types of tension, which to me is part of why we get stories like the essay that Mitra Kalita wrote in for Time. They're the co-founder and CEO of URL Media. They called the first year of being a manager the worst year of her life.
Yeah.
And it turns out she's not alone. An HBR survey of first-time managers found nearly 2/3 are uncertain or anxious about their new role. I think this transition is quite challenging. It's quite challenging to shift gears in this way. And I think it's also challenging if you feel like you don't either have a great role model or great support to learn how to do the new things that you're expected to do as a manager.
Yeah, I mean, when I started Juice Software, I remember a friend of mine said to me, "Oh, Kim, this is a hard situation for you because you hate the man and now you are the man and you're not even a man." And so it was tricky. It's especially if if you've learned what management is from negative examples instead of from positive examples, it's hard. But even if you've had positive examples, it's hard. And I don't know what the solution to this particular problem that I'm about to describe is, but one of the things that we found at Apple is that teaching people about management before they came managers didn't work very well. And that was when they had time to learn, and then teaching them after they became managers also didn't work that well because they were so busy.
Yeah.
And so there's sort of you may spend years learning how to become a lawyer. You may spend years learning how to become an engineer or to develop your sales skills or whatever it is that you do in your function. But most people get at best a day and a half long course about how to become a manager. And it's one of the most difficult things you can do. And so figuring out like how to speed up that learning process so that people, I think what happens usually with people is that they're sort of thrown into the deep end. And the problem is when you're thrown into the deep end of management, not only might you yourself drown, but you might drag 10 other people down with you. And that's stressful.
Yeah. And I think for leaders out there who are thinking about how do we create a sort of career path around management, Kim, I think you have some words of wisdom for them. Because in Radical Candor, you said, when management is the only path to higher compensation, the quality of management suffers. And the lives of people who work for these reluctant managers become miserable. So at the very least,
Yes.
It cannot be the only way to succeed. Given how challenging it is to become a manager, there needs to be another path for growth.
Yeah, and it's really important. I mean, and I think it's really important, and that in at tech firms that was pretty well developed, at least at Google and Apple where I worked, for engineers. So if you were an engineer at either Google or Apple, you could progress along a technical career path or a leadership career path. And at Google, at least, the technical career path was actually more prestigious than the management career path. It was more sought after and maybe slightly better paid. And that was important, not because I think a technical path is worth more necessarily than a management path, but because in the usual course of things, the managers wound up with all the power. So they sort of had to create a counterbalance to that. When I was teaching this class, managing at Apple, I remember there was one very awkward moment where we would always bring in these leaders at Apple to talk about management and what it was like managing at Apple. And one day we brought in this engineer who I didn't really know, and I didn't vet these people. They just sort of came into the beginning of sort of teaching this class, managing at Apple. And this guy said, "Yeah, I'm glad you all are doing this because my agreement at Apple is don't make me manage anyone and I will not quit." It was sort of very awkward. Everybody was like, but I think that's a real attitude among people. Is some people have this dread of management, and if you dread it, if you understand what it is and you dread it and you really don't want to do it, then don't do it. Like figure out. And if you're a leader, you need to create a path for people. Like there are certain salespeople who should get bigger and bigger accounts, and they should continue to grow in their career, but not by leading other salespeople because they're not interested in the things that they don't want to do the things that managers need to do.
Yep. So I feel like you're taking us into our next topic, which is questions to ask yourself before becoming a manager. And I think you started to illustrate some qualities of people who should not be managers?
Yeah, and I don't know if these are qualities because I think you can teach people to. I don't think leadership is some kind of innate attribute. I don't think management.
Yeah,
I
fair
think you
point.
can teach people, but I do think if you enjoy talking to people one on one about the problems that they are having and solving their problems, then that's a good sign that you would be a good manager. If you find it incredibly irritating and disruptive to your flow when people come in to you and talk to you about their problems, that's maybe a sign that you're not a great manager. Actually, I would say, I mean, this is a weird sort of test. So you can tell me if you think it's a good one or a bad one, Jason.
Okay,
But
go for it.
I think if you love to read novels, it's a sign you're going to be a good manager because it's a sign that you're interested in like getting inside someone else's head and understanding how they're approaching life. So I think actually novel reading. In fact, Brandy and I were talking earlier about maybe making a list of books that managers should read that have been very helpful for me. And there's going to be a lot of novels. There's not going to be as many management books on that list, although there are some great ones. But there's going to be a lot of novels. So I think, being really interested in other people and what makes them tick, and especially being interested in other people who maybe have a very different approach to life than you have is really important for being a good manager. I think getting a real bang out of watching other people grow and when other people succeed, can you really cheer them on wholeheartedly? Are you
Mm,
thrilled when they succeed? I think an interest in teaching people stuff they don't know. Like there was one moment when my daughter was very little and we were drawing and I drew a shark from the side, and it had one eye. And she was 3, I think, at this point. And she said, "Well, sharks have 2 eyes. Why don't you have 2 eyes on your shark?" And I turned my head so she saw it in profile and I said, "How many eyes do you see?" And she, her eyes got big with understanding all of a sudden. She's like, "Oh,"
hmm
And it was like a small moment, but it was so incredibly satisfying for me to be able to explain that to someone who had no idea what perspective was. So if that gives you a real thrill to explain something to someone, then that's a good sign that you're going to be a good manager. You also have to have some patience with managing conflict. Yeah. So what were we going to say about managing conflict?
I think before we get to conflict, I think you have to be comfortable with disagreement and like vigorous disagreement. Even before it becomes like an actual conflict where there's tension in the room. Like part of being a manager is creating space for and welcoming differing views. The temptation is to treat every disagreement as a conflict, like something that needs to be resolved. When often the disagreement can work itself out, right? There can be a debate or discussion that works itself out before it becomes a conflict. But there are some people who are very uncomfortable with disagreement. Like in the presence of disagreement, they retreat as opposed to saying, "Yes, tell me more about that. Like, why do you feel so differently than I feel? Or why do you understand the situation so differently than I do?" I think that like curiosity about how someone arrived at a very different conclusion than the one that you arrived to, it is like an essential ingredient in being able to be a manager over the long run.
Yeah, and I think the word that you chose, curiosity, is much better than comfort because I'm very uncomfortable with conflict or
Yep.
disagreement. Like it
Yeah.
makes me makes me very uncomfortable. But if I can shift into that novel mindset where I'm like, oh, why do they understand this? Why are they thinking about this that way, or what's going on here?
Yep.
Then I can find the wherewithal to overcome my discomfort and to help them come to an agreement. I mean, I think conflict resolution is probably one of my least favorite parts of being a manager, but it is part of the job. And so being able to find some way to manage conflict in a way that doesn't send you into some kind of spiral is really important. And
Yeah,
I think for a lot of people, it's uncomfortable. I don't think you have to be
I
comfortable
totally
per se.
I totally agree with you. I think it is uncomfortable. What you said about adopting a curiosity mindset, I kind of see that as the flip side of the coin of the perspective story, right? Which is like, on
Yeah.
the one hand, it's helpful to want to show people a different way of looking at things, and on the other hand, it's also really helpful to constantly be curious for your own sake to find different ways of looking at things or different ways of understanding things.
Yeah. And to be patient, I mean, my daughter was 3, so it was more natural to be patient with her. But you could imagine that one could in that kind of situation be like, "Why don't you understand that I'm doing this from the side?" You know?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
sort of taking it like, why is she asking me this question that where anytime something seems obvious to me, I know that I need to take a deep breath and realize that it's not obvious to the other person for some kind of good reason, not because the other person is stupid, but because they have a different perspective. And I need to be confidently humble. I just did a radical candor talk for a CEO, and when we talked about humble as being one of the things, he said people folks need to be confidently humble. And I really liked that. Sort of Amy and I had talked about the problems with the word humble. Uh, so humble not meaning allow yourself to be humiliated, but humble meaning curious and open. So confident, and that requires a good deal of confidence. So I think that is part of what is really helpful.
so these are sort of like introspective, right? We're talking about how do we look inside ourselves and see if the seeds of being a great manager are in there, and they don't have to be innate qualities, but there's sort of interest or curiosity, a desire to learn some of the things that would make one into a great manager. Now let's go to the other side of the equation for a second, and think about the folks who are deciding whether or not to promote someone into management. So you're sitting there and someone says, "I'm ready. I am excited to be a manager." What are some questions one might ask in that situation to help you reveal whether or not that person is ready at that moment to sort of step up into management?
I think that one simple question is, why are you interested in management? And often people will give you sort of nutty answers. So, for example, there was a friend of mine from business school who called me up and said he was looking for a CEO role. And I happened to know of a COO role that was open. And so I said, why not a COO
Mm,
role? And his response to me was, well, if I'm the CEO, other people have to deal with my neuroses. But if
all
I'm the
right.
COO, then and I think that that is a terrible, terrible, terrible reason to be to become a manager. So I think one of the things that we haven't talked about as is you need to do the work on yourself that is necessary. I was talking to a young CEO recently who said that the most important thing that he did as he became a CEO was get a good therapist,
Mm,
and not a good coach, but a good I mean, also a good coach, but a
right.
therapist is different from a coach. And to do the work on himself so that he wasn't imposing his neuroses on others. So ask that question: why do you want to be a manager? Like, and if the person wants power, then that's not a good reason. If the person wants to neglect doing the work on themselves that they need to do, that is not a good reason. So just ask that question, like, why do you want to be a manager?
I think a corollary to that is to ask someone, what does a manager do at your company? Because like every organization has a slightly different perspective on what a manager does. But I think that this question from the top of the episode of, do you want to do the things that
Yeah.
managers do? So like, not only what is your motivation, but like what do you imagine yourself doing? Because I think one of the things that I have noticed is that there are a lot of people who come to management at the wrong moment, who think that management is the right move for them, and they're probably right, but they're just not right now. Like there's just
Yeah.
they need some time.
Yeah.
And often it boils down to the things that managers do, less about the mindset and the motivation, but like, are you actually ready? Are you going to be happy spending your time the way that a manager spends their time?
Yeah. Are you going to be happy in one-on-one meetings? Are you going to be
Yep.
happy soliciting feedback? I mean, another great question is, what's the best feedback you've ever gotten? And asking if the person is always talking about getting feedback from their boss and never talking about getting feedback from a peer or from someone who is sort of has more recently joined the organization than they have,
Yep.
then that's not a great sign. I mean, you want to make sure that people are open to hearing the perspective of others.
That perspective taking, there's probably many different ways of getting at it, but like another interesting question might be, what's something that someone else did or said that changed the way that you look at how we work?
Yeah.
Or the work that we're doing at the company? Because that is the other thing that I think is the sort of like mental agility, the willingness to change one's mind in the face of evidence that there's a better way to approach things.
Yeah. I mean, another thing is to pay attention to how they behave with people who they perceive to be less powerful than they are.
Mm,
And so are they, like, if someone is rude to your assistant, never ever promote them to management
yeah.
without giving them that feedback. Take them out to lunch and notice how they treat the waiter. I think that is really important to notice how people deal with power. Or is it going to go to their head?
Have you ever had someone who worked for you who came to you with regrets, who said, I have made the wrong choice. I wish I did not become a
Yes.
manager."
Yes, absolutely. And I've always worked really hard to find an off ramp for that person that helps them achieve what they want to achieve in their career, because that kind of self-awareness is priceless,
Mm.
and you want to reward that.
What's coming to mind is this idea of a pre-mortem. I wonder if an interesting conversation to have with someone who is considering becoming a manager is this sort of pre-mortem conversation of like, imagine your worst day as a manager.
Yeah.
Like everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. How are you feeling? What do you do when it all goes wrong? Because I do think there's a resilience element to management. We talked about high frustration tolerance, or the willingness to sort of be in disagreement or conflict with somebody else. But I think at the end of the day, like your advice about a therapist relates to this, but at the end of the day, there's also this element of resilience, a willingness to get back up and do it again tomorrow, even though it might seem sort of fruitless. Like there are moments of doubt. I think like I'm trying to think of like back and over the course of my career, like most of the conversations I had about either becoming a manager or seeking a promotion tended to be almost Pollyanna-ish, like positive, like, oh, like because there was a desire, people wanted to push me because they thought I had some potential, but also probably because they're like, well, Jason's reliable and he's going to take work off my plate if he takes his promotion. So like, there's this thing that I experience where people are like, oh, it's so great being a manager and like all this other stuff. I wonder if there's a conversation to be had about, maybe it's similar to this podcast of just sharing those moments of like when things went wrong, what would you do if you found yourself in that situation?
Yeah, and I think another aspect of being a manager is just dealing with stress. It's incredibly stressful, because when you're leading a team of people, one aspect of the job is almost like you're an emotional shock absorber. Like people are
Yep.
bringing you their stress all day long, and you have to be able to process their stress as well as your own stress.
Yep.
And it is really exhausting. It is, I just think that there's so much emotional labor that is part of being a good manager that is really, really tiring. And figuring out, like, making sure that you have the wherewithal to remain calm. And at one point at Juice, I remember I realized that one of the most important things I could do was go running every day.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what I needed to do in order to process my own stress. And if I didn't go running every day, I was going to start snapping at people. And realizing that that was like instead of feeling guilty about taking the time to go running, whether that meant I came in a little later than I otherwise would have, or go out in the middle of the day and go running, I needed to realize that that was actually part of my job, as surely as talking to people about the stresses that they were going under, and getting enough sleep. Like there would be times where I'd feel like, oh, I could do another hour of analysis from 10 to 11, but I really need to go to sleep at 10 o'clock. And that was part of my job, taking care of myself. You want to make sure that people will be able to take care of themselves, because the stress is I think not to be underestimated.
Yeah, I like that question. So we talked about that when we were saying, what do you ask yourself before becoming a manager? It's like,
Yeah.
how am I managing my stress? You talked about getting a therapist. I think the reason I like that question better than, do you have a high frustration tolerance, is it's very practical. So the question of like, how do you manage your stress?
Yeah.
There should be an answer, which is like, well, these are the things that I do. Like if I'm having a tough day, I go for a job. Like you're looking for people to have a practical answer to that question. It's
Yeah.
not abstract. It should be very like tangible and practical.
Yeah.
And if it's not, that it may not be determinative as to whether or not this person is ready to be a manager, but it might be a really useful moment to say like, hey, this is actually really critical. This is a critical part of being a manager, is knowing how you manage your own stress level. And so that's a great conversation to have, regardless of whether someone is a manager or about to become one. It's like, how do you manage your stress?
Yeah.
And getting down to those sort of practical details. In the book, you talk about the sort of happiness recipe. Like, what are the things that you need to feel fully engaged, to feel well and fully engaged at work?
Yeah. And I think also, like, I guess I feel a little bit like I'm a person who I do have low frustration tolerance myself for certain things. And so sort of like being stuck in traffic or waiting in line, like my only prenuptial agreement with my husband is that I would never have to go to Disneyland, because that kind of waiting in line stress is something that I hate. And so I feel like for a lot of normal things, I have extremely low frustration tolerance. But for management, I have so I think it's because I'm interested in other people. Like for editing a book, I have high frustration tolerance. So do you have frustration tolerance for the things you're going to have to do
as a manager?
Yeah, as a manager, or whatever job you decide to take. Because what is tedious to one person is fascinating to another. Like I cannot read, as you know, Jason, I cannot read a legal document. I just can't, I can't break through the language, the tedium. But other, I know a lot of lawyers who love their work.
Same here. And I think I having had the opportunity to collaborate with you on expressive work, like essays or scripts that we've worked on together or something, I know that you also have a very high tolerance. Even though I feel like my tolerance is reasonably high for a legal document, I feel like you have an even higher tolerance for frustration tolerance for refining the words to express an idea exactly as you want. So I've observed that difference in you, and I think if you're in the position of considering someone for promotion, you should have that kind of data. You should be looking back to those observations. Like, what are some moments that I can look back on in my experience with this person that show me that they have resilience, frustration tolerance in the face of the kinds of ambiguity or sort of tedious things that are likely to come up as they become a manager.
Yeah, are they going to get a bang out of the problems that managers have,
exactly?
Or are they going to approach them with dread?
I think that in some ways, I think that is, to me, is the vibe of this entire conversation that we've had. Is that management can be incredibly exciting because it gives you an opportunity to flex a specific set of muscles that have to do with curiosity about other people's experiences, the desire to sort of empathize with other people's points of view, getting a kick out of helping people solve their problems as opposed to solving
Yeah.
your own problems. Like, it can be really thrilling to be a manager. It can be incredibly fulfilling. It is tiring. All of these things take energy. They're not free. So it does take energy, and knowing how you manage your own energy is really important to make sure that you have it available to help people when they need it. And I think the flip side of it is it could also be horrible. Like, it could be like it could be the worst job in the world for you. If those things do not sound interesting to you, then being a manager, or rather doing the things that managers do, is going to make you very unhappy.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing, because to your point, there's lots of opportunities in the world for non-managers. Like, in fact, the majority of people who do work are not managers.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's lots of opportunity out there.
Yeah. And there's a lot of, I would say right now at this point in my life, I'm spending more time writing, and you're the manager. I'm not we've worked it out. So I can go and have those long, I never could have written Just Work without you and the Radical Candor team taking on all the work of running the company so that I could have those long uninterrupted patches of time.
Yep.
So there's, which doesn't mean that I don't care about management. It's just that I know that when I'm in one mode, in writer mode, I cannot be in manager mode.
Yeah. And so I think if you are out there listening to this and you're wondering if you should become a manager, I think what I would be looking for is an emotional response to our conversation. If you started to get excited when we were talking about all the hairy issues that you have to figure out, or problems you have to help solve, or walking a mile in somebody else's shoes, if all that sounded great to you, then you're probably on the right path. And the same thing if you're evaluating someone for a management role. If that's what excites them, is helping other people succeed and building a team, caring about the experience of other people, then you're probably looking at someone who maybe not right this moment, but who is a reasonably good candidate for management. But if someone is sitting in front of you and telling you, I want to be a manager, but I want to be a manager because I'm sick of being told what to do and I just want to tell other people what to do, then you're probably not talking to someone who is ready to be a manager yet.
Yeah, exactly right. And I will say, when I started Juice, I started it in part because I had all these negative examples of managers who I had. And I thought, if I'm the CEO, everything will be great. And it was not great. Actually, and it was a very humbling and important lesson, which is that a lot of being a manager is about sort of setting up systems and rules so that nonsense doesn't happen. But just because you're a good person doesn't mean that good things will happen. In fact, almost certainly bad things will happen if you don't design the way that your team works to be fair. Then you're going to sort of create systemic injustice, and that's no good.
All right, so let's wrap up the episode today with our checklist. Tips you can use to start putting Radical Candor into practice.
Tip number 1, before becoming a manager or promoting someone else to manager, ask the question, do you want to be a manager for power, money, control? Or do you want to do the things that managers do, like coaching, soliciting and giving feedback, and building teams to get stuff done?
Tip number 2, before becoming a manager, commit to doing the work on yourself that's necessary for you not to impose your neuroses on others, so that you can lead from a place of collaboration and curiosity versus command and control.
Tip number 3, mental agility is an incredibly important quality in managers. Are you able to change your perspective in the face of new evidence or information? Do you know how to manage stress and do the things that you need to do to stay centered? If not, management is probably not right for you right now.
For more tips, you can go to radicalcandor.com/resources to download our free learning guides, sign up for Radical Candor on Masterclass, get our lit video book, register for our workplace comedy series, The Feedback Loop, and more. To see the show notes for this episode, head to radicalcandor.com/podcast. Praise in public, criticize in private. If you like what you hear, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. If you have criticism for us, please email it to us at podcast@radicalcandor.com. We really do appreciate getting it, and we read every one.
And we will reward the candor.
Yes, we will. Bye for now.
Bye for now. All right. And now we have a bonus segment. We're going to talk about these are some of the things we love, some of the products that we love. And we'll put a link to these products so you can buy them on Amazon or anywhere else where you like to buy stuff. So one of the things that I've learned recently is that we use almost as much oil and gas in making single-use plastics as we do in our cars. And so I'm really working on eliminating single-use plastics from my life. And one of the things that was bugging me every day when I washed my hair, which I do just about every day, was squeezing shampoo out of a single-use plastic bottle. And so I found these Attitude Leaves bars. Here they are, Attitude's Leaves bars, shampoo and conditioner. I was so skeptical that I could condition my hair with a bar of conditioner, but it works great. So I recommend it. If you also hate single-use plastics, I really recommend that you try this. Bye for now.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.